Hello, everybody. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to McDuff Lives. And tonight, it's a little after 8 p.m. on Wednesday night here at May what is it, the 17th, I think. Yeah, the May the 17th of 2023. And I don't often do a Mindfields in the evening, and I'm glad to have a chance to do one tonight. Usually I have my trios or one of my great usual guests on Wednesday nights, but tonight I thought I'd do something different, and so we're going to delve into the subject of General Lyman Lemnitzer and his incredible career, a person who most people have heard of through Operation Northwoods, the plan developed in 1962, which was in order to get the American people behind an invasion of Cuba, that an American airliner might be shot down and blamed on the Cubans, a false flag operation. Other false flag operations were part of the planning. You don't hear about all of them. It's pretty much left at that. But we do have a lot of good research having been done in the past. And tonight I'm going to feature a book called Gladio, Nature's Dagger at the Heart of Europe, the Pentagon Nazi Mafia Terror Axis by Richard Cottrell. And here's the book. There. Now I picked this up before I went on a week at the beach last 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago. Boy, it seems like a long time ago. But anyway, this was one of the 5 books I brought to the beach, and the only one that I spent any real time with, because it allows me to get to know the character of this General Lyman Lemnitzer and how important he is in studying McDuff and McDuff's career. And before I jump into the material for tonight, just to set the stage, you can imagine my dad in 1960. President Kennedy is elected, and he starts in 1961. And then my father is then at that time working for the FBI. And by all the information I can find, he seems to have been fairly close to and relied upon by J. Edgar Hoover. So he was approached to join a Pentagon operation called SACSA, and that was the acronym for the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Operations. And to join that operation, that new entity called SACSA, would mean he would leave the FBI and transfer to the Department of Defense. Well, he accepted the position and began. He was recruited in the beginning of 62, the end of 61. He corresponded with J. Edgar Hoover to make sure that it was all right with him that he take the position. What else was going on behind the scenes about that, I'm not really sure, but it's possible, of course, that there's more to it than meets the eye in that single letter I have from my father to Hoover, saying that he appreciated the consent that Hoover gave to him applying for this job, the planner of special operations, because this was very, very crucial for President Kennedy to take the special operations away from Allen Dulles and Richard Bissell and General Cabell and the CIA as it was being run at that time under the Eisenhower administration, and the distinct differences between Kennedy's approach to foreign policy and what was going on in the hands of an Allen Dulles as the director of Central Intelligence at the time. So they proved their lack of intelligence by failing at the Bay of Pigs operation in April of 61. And it's not long after that, that they start Kennedy administration and with Bobby Kennedy organizing a group to try to fill in the blanks where we're going to need to create a new regime for operating the counterinsurgency and special operations programs. And so that was a major, major blow to the established uh, right wing Allen Dulles CIA set that were fired. So my dad, of course, comes in April. His first day of work is April the 1st, 1962, but he can't appear for duty because he's in the hospital because he has suddenly come down with a case of hepatitis. And the story about that, of course, I can tell you what I know, but that would take up a lot of the evening tonight. So let's just start with the fact that, okay, my dad's very first day, he is unable to go there because of what I view as a very suspicious case of hepatitis. No, it was not an alcoholic type of hepatitis, just so you know that. It was clearly an infection. Excuse me. Now, what kind of a hornet's nest was he walking into when he leaves the FBI and goes to the Pentagon? Well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is our subject tonight, Lyman Lemnitzer. And just to introduce the book a little bit, as you know, I've read Operation Gladio by Paul Williams, an excellent book that I think is still available. Here it is on my shelf. This one, I've read like 20 chapters of this book, and it's really a terrific tour de force. So you already should be aware of Operation Gladio, and what it was supposedly a stay-behind units, army units around Europe that were there to rise up in case the Soviets invaded Western Europe. And they were the stay-behind armies, supposedly, but they were actually much more than that. And that is the subject of Gladio, NATO's dagger at the heart of Europe, the Pentagon Nazi Mafia Terror Axis by Richard Cottrell. Now, Richard Cottrell is British. He was a member of the European Parliament back in the 90s. This book is copyrighted 2010 and 2015. So the edition I have is 2015. A little introduction to the book itself. Masquerading as rear guard against Soviet invaders, NATO's covert forces warped into psychological and physical terrorism. These were the years of lead in which hundreds perished in a synthetic war in the streets of Europe. NATO Commander General Lyman Lemnitzer ordered serial attacks on French President Charles de Gaulle. Sacked from the Pentagon by John F. Kennedy for rank insubordination, then exiled to Europe, Lemnitzer reaped revenge in Dallas. The secret armies forged bonds with organized crime and neo-fascists. NATO-backed coups struck down governments in Greece and Turkey. The island state of Cyprus was sundered amid bitter genocide. Urban guerrillas like the Red Brigades and Baader Meinhof gang were cunningly manipulated. Italy gained a deep state government. The ultra-secret P2 pseudo-Masonic lodge founded by former black shirts. Swedish PM Olaf Palme and Italian ex-PM Aldo Moro were assassinated. Pope John Paul II was shot by Turkish gangsters who had regular work as Gladio guns for hire. In 2009, a Gladio copycat outfit codenamed Ergenekon came to light in Turkey. The shootings in Norway in July 2011 and in Belgium, France, and Italy in 2012 still bore the classic stripe of Gladio false flag operations. So the author then gives a number of prefaces, one of them just to make sure that I don't forget to mention it, because I do think it's very important. He mentions Jimmy Savile, the English Dutroux, and the protection racket shielding establishment vice. And of course, this ties into Dope Incorporated, and the fact is that it's all really turns out to be one big, uh, ugly conspiracy. So the business on Seville and the politicians that were caught up with him in Britain is very interesting. The next couple of chapters go into just a kind of a basic summary of what Gladio is, and what it is a number of secret army units that are identified by their nation or their ethnicity. And these units all are created or working underneath of the supervision of NATO, of General Lemnitzer. And the fact is that this type of scenario is exactly what we were talking about happening, in the 19th century with the British intelligence system under Lord Palmerston creating the mafia in New Orleans, the uh, Knights of the Golden Circle, the Bernai Barith, and other secret organizations or brotherhoods that had secret uh, communications as part of their intelligence operations in the United States. And so now we have the NATO operating a very similar idea of spreading different secret armies in different countries based upon the whatever conflicts might be going on in that country, or to try to foment a revolution. So these are going on in the 50s and the 60s under the policies of the Pentagon. So I'm just going to start reading here at page 18. The appointment of the much decorated General Lyman Lemnitzer as Supreme Commander of all NATO forces in Europe in 1963 brought one of the U.S. Army's most committed enthusiasts for black warfare into the highest seat of power within the alliance. The Pentagonian Chief of Staff had recently been rudely sacked and effectively exiled by President John F. Kennedy on justifiable grounds of rank insubordination. With Lemnitzer's arrival, Gli anni di piombo, the years of lead, erupted with a vengeance. Lemnitzer's colossal ego had permitted him to coldly propose a scheme to JFK calling for mafia hoodlums to shoot Americans walking about the streets and then blame Cuban subversives. Parentheses, the Northwoods plot, chapter 3. A looking-glass war was fought on European soil with identical methods, and similar alliances came quite naturally to such a twisted mind. Lemnitzer could quietly nod when Trotsky spoke of combining all available means to meet the desired ends. In good time, he reaped revenge on the man he despised as a closet communist, a president he demeaned as, quote, with no military experience, some kind of patrol boat captain, unquote. Kennedy revealed his fatal weakness in Lemnitzer's arid gaze by bowing to the Soviets in the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. Lemnitzer was among the chief architects of the strategy of tension and brought with him a wealth of experience gained from earlier commands in Southeast Asia. There, and later in the Pentagon, he was under the spell of the immensely unorthodox Air Force Colonel, later General Edward Lansdale. His specialty lay in bizarre voodoo-like schemes of psy-war and false flag operations. Lansdale was like the inspiration for the manic Northwoods conspiracy, was likely the inspiration for the manic Northwoods conspiracy. The probability that both men were arms linked in Dallas on 22nd November were arms linked in Dallas on the 22nd of November 1963 is also explored in detail again in chapter 3. It was no accidental coincidence between Lemnitzer's fascination for Lansdale's eclectic methods and the morbid orders that went out to Gladio units under NATO command to kill innocent civilians, quietly going about their lives. This was the selfsame blueprint Lemnitzer had proposed to the appalled John F. Kennedy to justify invading Cuba. Lemnitzer was a seminal figure in other ways. NATO was, of course, a rib cut from the American atom, an offshoot of Pentagonia. But at least until Lemnitzer's time, there was some mood of a coalition with a common righteous cause, an alliance constructed on the basis of mutual defense, drawing on the ideas of Niccolo Machiavelli concerning well-organized but non-aggressive deterrence. Is not without just cause. Lemnitzer changed all that to a zealous crusade pursued in the ruthless interests of the United States. He saw no moral hazards or ambiguity because America had, after all, saved, that is, conquered Europe, and was thus entitled to claim rightful homage by droit de seigneur. Henceforth, European states must select governments conforming to the American imperial mission, or the consequences could be painful. Lemnitzer's poisoned chalice handed down to the current generation is an alliance without a cause, a pinfold of obedient sheep who bray hosannas at every motion from the gods of war in Washington. However, as this book was preparing for press, NATO's Libyan war raised issues with blind obedience to the imperial writ by Turkey, Italy's Berlusconi government, and peripherally Germany. Well, that was in 2015 at best. So the American imperial mission, Pentagonia, and the idea that the Pentagon is an empire. Again, this is a book that's written by a British man, and his perspective, I think, is pretty widely held. So we can get into whether this is actually as bad as an imperial ambition of the Joint Chiefs, but it looks that way to him, and it certainly is a fair way to look at the situation, in my view. So far, we have pursued the theme which suggests that Gladio's secret armies were the main agent in manufacturing synthetic terrorism in order to ward off the latent appeal of communism to the European masses. Thanks to Yves Guérin-Serac, we see now that NATO happily dramatized a non-existent threat of Soviet subversion. This is an opportune moment to introduce some famous words uttered by the American president, former general of the Army, and D-Day invasion commander Dwight Eisenhower. Here is the legendary tablet of stone that the great national monument handed down, parentheses, somewhat belatedly, to the American people on the 17th of January, 1961, his last day in office. In the council, this is Ike. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals to that security and liberty so that security and liberty may prosper together. A war machine without wars to fight or even prospective enemies is a contradiction in terms. Yet these were the discomforting circumstances in which NATO now found itself when the Berlin Wall collapsed, followed by the entire Soviet order. Shortly before his death in 1946, the great economist and New World Order progenitor John Maynard Keynes expressed the gloomy view that post-war America might find it difficult to sustain lasting economic prosperity without maintaining a war machine in full working order. The late Professor Seymour Melman of Columbia University described the U.S. war machine and all its components, including NATO, as permanent war socialism. Matters had been moving in the direction of Eisenhower's valedictory warning since 1947. In July of that year, the National Security Act established a permanent military hierarchy in the form of the Imperial High Command, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as an emerging parallel government. For good measure, America was blessed with its first peacetime espionage organization, the Central Intelligence Agency. It would become the personal Praetorian Guard of every future president. At the stroke of his pen, President Harry Truman invented the Cold War. So, the author views the Pentagon at this point from 1947, creating an empire, an imperial parallel government. And I just take a step back and just offer you my own thoughts about this broadly in terms of the JFK assassination. We have, of course, looked at the CIA as a potential force that murdered the president. We have looked at Lee Harvey Oswald as a lone shooter and rejected that idea. We've also looked at the British and the British influence. We've looked at the FBI and Division 5 and the Torbett Memorandum. We've looked at the Synarchy and the connections through the Dallas Schlumberger and Jean de Menil and the Synarchy, and we've looked at the White Russians. But have we really taken a hard look at the Pentagon and take a look at see what is Lansdale? You know, why does it look like Lansdale is there in Dallas in that picture, where he's identified by none other than Victor Krulak, who is the SACSA, my father's boss, in 1962-63. Well, it's very intriguing. But the other point to make about Lansdale before we get back to reading is this. This is somebody that's clearly double-hatted. And the phrase double-hatted comes to me from Doug Valentine. And this, of course, is the idea that you have two jobs. You have the official job and you have the other job. And Colonel and then later General Lansdale is an Air Force officer, so his loyalty is to the Air Force. But he's also a CIA officer, and his loyalty is to the CIA. He has the responsibilities to report to both. And the suggestion is made that my dad was also double-hatted, in that when he was taken from the FBI and put in the Pentagon, he still had duties to the FBI, that he still was to coordinate, at least in some instances, with J. Edgar Hoover. And that makes it very interesting when you look at David Wise's great book about Cassidy's Run and my dad's role in that. Well, here we're starting to see, that my dad is getting thrown into a real hornet's nest at the Pentagon, where these egotistical generals think that they are running the government. Now, the next section runs into George F. Kennan and the long telegram, the containment doctrine. And if you don't know what that is, it is the containment. It is the domino theory, and we will not give an inch to the communists, no matter what. The really crazy right wing attitude of better dead than red is that was the thought by these generals, and Lemnitzer is certainly the prime example. So I'm now going to turn to chapter 2. It's called The Curse of the Two-Edged Sword, and it looks like we've got about a half hour left, so I'm going to read a good bit of this. Speaks of the author Danielle Ganser, who wrote a definitive book on Operation Gladio. It's a book I should have on the shelf, but I don't. But it is the primary source of this author's details in what he says about the years of lead and the operation. And the killing of Olaf Palme, of course, comes into play. Let's see now. So after he basically concludes that the killing of Olaf Palme was a Operation Gladio operation, and let's read on from there. I'm going to skip forward to the point where General Lemnitzer comes back in. Oh, I see where I wanted to be. May the Force be with you is the name of title of chapter 3. Toward the end of 2006, John Bolton, short-lived United States ambassador to the United Nations, a feisty, walrus-mustached antidote to conventional diplomacy, dropped one of his famous verbal grenades into a respectful audience of visiting European journalists. "You must understand," he declared, fixing them with a look reserved for moments of intimate candor, "that the United States never acts except in its own interests." To Bolton, there was nothing intrinsically intimidating in this remark. He was simply expressing the deeply held opinion of many patriotic Americans, the concept of American exceptionalism. Bolton's reputation as a neocon cyborg bent on castrating the United Nations obscured the fact that he simply paraphrased Lord Palmerston's famous dictum that nations have no permanent friends or allies, they only have permanent interests. The United States is a serial trespasser in her own neighborhood. Large chunks of real estate were lopped off from Mexico. The independent and stunning Eden-like innocence of the Hawaiian kingdom was ruthlessly crushed. Spain, a decadent and corrupt empire, but also an unfortunate European blemish on the American hemisphere, a bad case of the others, was tricked into a phony war. She lost what was remaining of her empire, including the crown jewel, Cuba. That splendid little war, as the boisterous Teddy Roosevelt delightedly called it, subsequently characterized by the behavior of the United States on the world stage. A brief and highly successful romp was the first in modern times to qualify for the label of a liberal intervention. thus fixing it firmly in the linear trail of unilateral corrections to the internal affairs of other countries deemed of crucial strategic interest to the United States. The Spanish American War was certainly splendid enough to vault the triumphant Roosevelt to the White House once a vacancy was declared following President McKinley's convenient assassination in 1901. In 1904, the unfinished works of the canal zone of the Panama Canal were taken over and fenced off with a client safety strip, the Canal Zone. In 1915, Woodrow Wilson, the great peacemaker, exploited riots and instability as an excuse to send Marines ashore in Haiti. They stayed for nearly 20 years until Haiti's debts to American banks were paid off. Spain took the full rap for the Maine. The explosion provoked the rallying cry, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." The following day, Roosevelt made the cryptic, understated remark, "We shall never find out definitively the cause of the disaster." Well, obviously, we think now, and I think now, that it was a false flag event and exactly the kind of thing that Lemnitzer would come up with. The specter of the sunken Maine lingered too in strange ways. In 1997, decommissioning of secret documents relating to the JFK assassination revealed the inner court of the American military, the five great chiefs who held the high command, coolly hatching a plan to wreak mayhem across America, using hired snipers to shoot at citizens walking across the streets. They would then pin the blame on saboteurs spirited to American shores by Fidel Castro. It was perfectly simple. Pentagonia planned to attack the United States. It's an axiom of American life that all actions of men and women in military uniform are virtually beyond reproach. Hate the war, love the warrior. Yet here in cold print were detailed plans for acts of terror to be performed under the American flag on the orders of the highest military commanders in the land. This deadly project, codenamed Northwoods and dated March 1962, was aimed at garnering international support to justify a full-scale U.S. invasion of Cuba, fostering the illusion the regime in Havana had descended into diabolical lunacy. One proposal, blowing up an American vessel in Guantanamo Bay and then blaming it on Cuba, slipped straight from the main playbook. While perfectly happy to gun down civilians, the Navy's top brass cavilled at blowing up an American ship at sea, as that would entail killing the crew. So the fallback plan called for destruction of an unmanned ship and staging of simulated funerals. And isn't it sad to think, that then in 1967, the USS Liberty was attacked. Lyndon Johnson could have stopped it. He did not. And so many of our great servicemen were maimed, killed, and otherwise, injured for life. That attitude that people are expendable for some higher purpose is the way that these guys thought. And that's why people like McDuff have to come in and fix it. Like items on a shopping list, the denizens of the War Palace calmly ticked off the downing of airliners and the real or simulated sinking of boatloads of Cuban refugees. There would be attacks by carbon copies of Cuban MiG fighters on neighboring countries. Not the least grim aspect of the brazen campaign to fabricate a reign of red terror through Florida, and even down at the wide avenues of the capital itself, was the cynical targeting of Cubans who risked their lives escaping to freedom in ramshackle boats. In his book, Body of Secrets, on the ultra secret US NSA, James Bamford derided a virtual war in which many patriotic Americans and innocent Cubans would die senseless deaths, all to satisfy the egos of twisted generals back in Washington. One plan offered an eerie premonition and perhaps even some clues concerning the events of 9/11. It called for the hijacking of a U.S. passenger jet by special forces disguised as Cuban agents. The plane would slip below radar observation and then be replaced by a pilotless aircraft. This would crash, purportedly killing all the passengers and crew. The decoy plane would then land safely somewhere in the U.S., leaving the question open as to how all those on board could be relied upon to keep silent concerning their adventure. There was not a single item in the Northwoods manual that did not amount to a blatant act of treason. Yet the high and mighty of the entire U.S. military establishment dispatched, quote, top secret, justification for U.S. military intervention in Cuba, straight to the desk of Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara for onward transmission to President John F. Kennedy. Whether his carefully slicked trademark hair stood on end or he was anticipating the incoming missile is not known. Suffice it to say, within 3 days it returned from the Oval Office out tray, paper clipped to a presidential rejection slip. So this is what I'm saying. This is in March of 1962, and this is exactly when my dad is hired. So does it not look as though my dad is part of a team that's come in to take over from these guys, to get rid of Lansdale and Lemnitzer? And then, of course, what did they do to get rid of Lemnitzer in 1963? Well, as we've just read, he was sent to Europe as the commander of NATO. So he sets the tone for NATO in 1963 for the rest of that decade. Kennedy's thoughts as he leafed through the Cuban project can only be guessed, but perhaps he detected the icy hint of a scythe passing over the nape of his neck. The president was too subtle to suspect his most senior commanders had collectively departed their rockers. They were mad only in the sense of functioning in a deeply flawed environment, contaminated with the egotistical warrior nationalism soaking the country. Kennedy was as much cloaked in old glory as any of those Promethean princes brooding on the Virginia bank of the Potomac. Yet America's history of violent and unpredictable behavior towards her leaders suggested a president with a touchy relationship with his military should tread warily around the cursed siren of Cuba. Kennedy observed with considerable reservation the Crown Prince of the Pentagon, the taut-framed chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Lyman Lemnitzer. From the moment he arrived in the White House, the president understood he was pitched against an alternative government concealed in the dark pool containing the military elites, secret services, and the arms business. It was precisely that camp which Eisenhower warned Americans to be eternally vigilant against. The atmosphere of bad karma that clung to the Kennedy interregnum was unmistakable, along with its source. Arthur Schlesinger, JFK's intellectual guru, was asked in 1978 whether the president enjoyed a full grasp of his administration. He replied, well, we certainly weren't in control of the Joint Chiefs. The Kennedy presidency cut a confusing zigzag, making up its mind what to do about Cuba. The idea file was virtually bare on how to expunge Castro without dragging the U.S. into confrontation with his benefactors in Moscow. Into this breach stepped Lemnitzer with a parcel of schemes from a Pentagonian book of magic tricks. In a highly competitive shopping mall of conspiracies, he was up against rival attractions offered by the CIA. And there again is one of these crucial points that the Pentagon and the CIA are not identical in any way, except for we have within the Pentagon people like Lansdale who are CIA. So within this SACSA organization, my dad, who is neither CIA nor Pentagon, but he's a FBI guy and a Navy guy, but you know, um, his loyalty, his 10 years with the FBI is where he's coming from. So this is a group of people that are going to have a tremendous amount of tension. Lemnitzer soldiered his way from a frugal upbringing in a deeply conservative colony of German Lutherans in Honesdale, Pennsylvania. Second of three sons of pious and industrious parents, he shone at nothing in particular in school, leading to the sobriquet, "So who he," which followed him around for much of his early career. He got his first job clerking in a Main Street tailoring store and seemed destined to follow his father's footsteps into the family bootmaking business. Instead, he opted for army boots. He was a lackluster performer at West Point, graduating well down the class of 1920. Few among his peers thought he possessed the savvy to rise above a backroom brigadier general. This clinical judgment seemed confirmed by the 15 years he spent becalmed as an obscure junior officer before his career received a high-octane boost, thanks entirely to talents. So the unpromising chrysalis hatched into the most powerful and highly political soldier the U.S. Army produced since the Civil War, barring certain claims by Eisenhower himself, with the proviso that Ike never aspired to be a politician. The comparison to an American Generalissimo Franco in waiting, rather than the vain and erratic Prince of Mischief General Douglas MacArthur, was not misplaced. Eisenhower hovered over Lemnitzer like a guardian angel. The early middle-aged officer and the ramrod-bearing and piercing eyes caught his attention as promising staff material. He was soon put to work planning Allied landings in North Africa and Sicily. Eisenhower's hunch was rewarded by the accomplished manner in which Lemnitzer deployed carefully nuanced diplomacy and his sound inkling for German ways in a top secret mission of the highest delicacy, which Eisenhower believed vital to the outcome of the war. This was to persuade German forces trudging out of Italy to surrender outright. Eisenhower was mesmerized by the notion these hardened troops with all their munitions would connect with others falling back from the west to make a last stand around Hitler's fortress in Berchtesgaden, thus imperiling thousands of American Allied lives. Our author is telling us that Eisenhower had kind of picked Lemnitzer as a hunch and that he proves to be a good staff officer. He successfully leads, well, the Allied landings in North Africa cannot be called successful, okay? Sicily was successful, very successful. Eisenhower's hunch was rewarded by the Lemnitzer's carefully nuanced diplomacy and inkling for German ways in a top secret mission. In other words, he was working for Eisenhower to get the Germans to surrender, even though Roosevelt wanted the unconditional surrender. So here we are starting to involve Lemnitzer in Operation Sunrise. In the service of this chimera, he provoked a rift with Churchill and his pet general Bernard Montgomery, with far-reaching consequences for post-war Europe. The national redoubt, the myth of an impregnable fortress, was a Soviet hoax designed to allow Stalin an unchallenged lunge at Berlin. It succeeded brilliantly, thanks largely to Hitler's audacity and the shock he administered to the Allies with the famous boomerang known as the Battle of the Bulge, 16th December 1944 to 25th January 1945. German tanks suddenly burst out of the Belgian Ardennes forests and gave the advancing Allies very sore black eyes. Eisenhower, the rarest of supreme commanders, one who never in his entire career saw men die in action at the front line, took this as a clear warning that the Germans were far from exhausted or defeated. In the background, Time magazine flailed generals for idling while the Germans dug in. Lemnitzer played a neat hand. He was up with the masters of the universe alongside Alan Dulles, looking across the table at the immaculately presented enemy negotiators, at whose side he might have found himself in only marginally adjusted historical circumstances. At whose side? At the side of the Nazis. The Germans bought the counterfeit line that standing down would amount to a pause until the war resumed, this time against the Soviets. Lemnitzer thus demonstrated he was already a magician in the art of deception. The Platonic, noble, Porky, spoken in service of a higher cause, hallmark of early neoconservatives boarding Eisenhower's administration in significant numbers. The Lutheranism that Lemnitzer imbibed as a child made him an excellent fit with the bitterly anti-communist Prussian mindset, which overtook American military leadership after World War II. Many in the U.S. officer corps, like the priestly infantry in the Vatican, scarcely bothered to conceal their admiration for Hitler's punishment of godless Russia. The stunning innovations like the Blitzkrieg, shock and awe in the modern U.S. military manual, and the sheer stubborn belligerence of the German fighting soldier against all odds. Add to this the dazzling futuristic pioneering rocket science, which Lemnitzer eyed as a prize for the Army over the rival claims of Air Force commanders. Lemnitzer interpreted the clash of titans as an ongoing Manichaean struggle between light and darkness. God's own elect, the chosen people of the United States, pitched against the malignant and inherently evil Soviet Empire. Hardly by coincidence, this was exactly the driving force of fascist terrorists with strong ties to the Catholic Church who volunteered for Gladio armed struggles. A Manichaean struggle between light and darkness. Well, I think that's pretty much the book of Revelation is giving us the idea that we are stuck in this struggle between good and evil. And therefore, war is inevitable. I think that that whole philosophy is very, very pernicious and dangerous and bad for America that we would think that way because it's completely antithetical to our Constitution and the intentions expressed in the Declaration of Independence and all of the, the positive uh, forces that we believe caused this country to come into being. Once Eisenhower arrived in the White House, Lemnitzer's prospects assumed vertical liftoff. First, U.S. Command of U.S. forces in the Far East, then Army Chief of Staff, and finally top gun in the Pentagonian War Cabinet, all in the space of 5 years. Isn't that interesting? First of all, remember Eisenhower does not have the kind of combat experience that you would expect a general of the army to have had, like MacArthur, right? You also have now his protege, Lemnitzer, who doesn't have the experience that you would expect. And quickly rising up to the top, to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff within 5 years. Lemnitzer took care to associate himself with the most hawkish schemes. A shrewd Machiavellian element lay behind the power structure. The Joint Chiefs would operate more effectively when steered by a strong pair of hands. Eisenhower, with his own family roots in Germany's Rhineland-Palatine country, Eisenhower meaning hewer of iron, if a less than fully paid up Prussian, presided over what was in effect a military government, spending more time with his chiefs of staff and playing their war games than he ever did dealing with the civil distractions of state. The Pentagon was always his real command bunker and spiritual home, rather than the modest mansion at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Thanks to Eisenhower, the Council of War Chiefs matured into a permanent around-the-clock war cabinet, a metamorphosis posing awful perils. It happened because Eisenhower's national security policy, the New Look, which replaced the discarded strategy of limited war, was based on the unstoppable nuclear striking power of Strategic Air Command. It was straight back to the chimera of the national redoubt, which formerly obsessed Eisenhower in Europe, transposed this time to represent America herself. The new look invoked a psychological shift of profound consequences in American minds. Henceforth, the country was geared to a strategy of peace through the waging of perpetual war. Eisenhower's generous patronage of Lemnitzer arose at least partly because he recognized in his protege a strong likeness of himself, another young man who got off to an indifferent start in the military. Their lives seemed to march in a predestined lockstep. Eisenhower, too, plodded in the rear guard of the Army until the U.S. joined the war in 1941. After that, his rise was meteoric. He soared from a mere brigadier general to finish the war as supreme commander of all Allied forces in Europe, despite having no combat experience. Their common backgrounds, brought up by plain, God-fearing parents in white-on-white Anglo-Saxon communities, the Lutheran Lemnitzer, Eisenhower in a closeted community of Jehovah's Witnesses, led them to share virtually identical religions and political chemistry. Their shared rabid anti-communism came at the front. Eisenhower, far from the benign uncle figure so often portrayed, was a closet admirer of Senator Joe McCarthy's red-baiting sentiments. If not his histrionics, he and Lemnitzer reeled from the unspeakable horror of homosexuality, which they ranked with moral perversion and communism. Lemnitzer deeply approved when the president launched an executive witch hunt to root out sexual perverts, quote unquote, lurking in the federal government's employ. So when in 1960 Eisenhower crowned his protege chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, it seemed as though he was raising up his own son in his stead. The paternal skew towards Lemnitzer may well have arisen from such an emotion. Eisenhower was haunted all his life by the ghost of his eldest son, Dowd, who died aged 6 from scarlet fever. Lemnitzer deduced Americans were indeed living through dangerous times. The enemy was within and without the gates. America required the smack of firm government that owed its first allegiance to the only reliable guardian of her liberties, the country's armed forces. The constitutional order, in Lemnitzer's eyes, was subordinate at all times to national security. Lemnitzer's prize catch was Werner von Braun, the Fuhrer's rocket man, designer of the first projectile to achieve suborbital flight, was quietly spirited to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and then kitted out with all his needs to fashion weapons of mass destruction. But to Lemnitzer's huge chagrin, rocket science left successive U.S. governments stone cold until they woke up one October morning in 1957 to the alarming bleep, bleep, bleep of Sputnik, Russia's unexpected face pull from space. The ascendancy of Lemnitzer marked the steady glide of the top officer corps into the Everglades of McCarthyist madness. A strange, politically charged mood swept the broad boulevards of Washington, which implied an unfolding standoff between the High Command and the Commander-in-Chief. JFK's bedtime reading quite probably included the political thriller 7 Days in May, which appeared in 1961. The sensational plotline featured a fictional president called, with scarcely concealed finger-pointing, Lyman, who becomes the target of a right-wing coup staged by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Well, and I assume that you have some familiarity with that famous book and the movie. So, I spend many, many shows digging into the clearly evil Allen Dulles and the CIA and the things that they are doing, which destroy our individual liberties as well as, our nation's health and our nation's future. But we also have to recognize that there was this other insane quasi-parallel government being run by the extreme right wing. I guess the paleo conservatives would be the right word for these guys, the ones that would be associated with the WACL, the World Anti-Communist League, Le Cercle, and all of the connections that we've pointed out there, that these self-appointed guardians of America's freedom probably include President Eisenhower, if we accept, our author's view, which I think is probably accurate, that, he was really running these secret operations. He prided himself on not ever losing an American soldier in war during his presidency, of course. And who can blame him for that after the experience of World War II? So he was a person that not only permitted, but I think encouraged and supervised Allen Dulles and that side of the secret operations. But there's this Pentagon versus CIA aspect that is represented very well by the person of General Lyman Lemnitzer. So I hope this was somewhat interesting, and maybe you got something out of it that will help you to see the way the world really is. It helps me to put my father's life and career in perspective. March of 1962, the Northwoods Memorandum, and my father being transferred from the FBI to the Pentagon, special assistant for counterinsurgency and special operations. Thanks very much for being with me tonight. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow night, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, with Nick Pantofsky. I'm sorry, I got his last name on. Nick from Twitter, our good friend Pizza Pickle Spur on Twitter, and I'm looking forward to talking to him some more about his great work in fighting for the victims of AIDS and other viral diseases.